Hello. Thanks to everybody for joining us today. My name is Neil McCluskey. I am the director of the Center for Educational Freedom here at the Cato Institute. Today we will be discussing this new book right here. Oh, very zoomed in. Good. Fighting for the Freedom to Learn, Examining America's Centuries-Old School Choice Movement, which very basically covers school choice from the colonial period of American history straight through to today. I am one of the co-editors, and we are joined by James Schulz, who is really the more important of the co-editors. He is also the head of the Education Liberty branch of the Institute for Governance and Civics at Florida State University. So wave one more time, just so we know who you are, although your name's on there. All right, James. We are also very grateful to have with us today Ethan Hutt, who is the Gary Stuck Faculty Scholar in Education and a professor at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. So we're going to talk about the books today, or the book today. The way we're going to do it is James, for about 5 minutes, has been tasked with laying out basically why we put this book together and what it covers. Ethan's going to follow that with about 5 minutes of his thoughts on the book. I think, although I could be wrong, but I think both will focus maybe somewhat on what the movement before 1955 and after 1955, and I think you'll understand that once we get started why 1955 is important. But we'll talk about, what we can learn about maybe school choice going forward from those periods of time. Or maybe we won't. Maybe this will be full of surprises and we'll get into all sorts of things that even I didn't expect. But I think that's how it's going to go. After that, we'll get to questions and answers, some from me. I'll give some answers, and then we're going to focus a lot on Q&A from the audience. So if you have questions or comments, you can submit them on whatever platform you're on. And I know if you're on X, you can use hashtag Cato Events. And so with that, I'm going to hand it over to James to give us an overview of the book.
Well, thanks, Neil, and thank you so much for Cato for organizing it and for putting out this terrific volume. It really is a wonderfully printed book. I was super excited about the quality of the production. So it's been wonderful to be a part of it. We started this. It starts from a very simple premise, and it's that this idea of fighting for the freedom to learn is not new. It's not a new impulse. It's an impulse that has been around for a very long time. And the idea of parents fighting for the education of their children, of communities rallying together around a common cause of education, It's not new, and yet today we somehow have some sort of historical amnesia. On both the left and the right, we look at these modern movements for school choice, especially around vouchers or scholarship programs, and we try to look at the founding of those things and talk about when they started. And we might talk about 1990 being the first modern voucher program, but really, what both the left and the right do, or the pro and against sides do, is they point to the 1950s as the real origin of school choice and of the modern sort of voucher movement. So the proponents, they point to Milton Friedman's 1955 essay on the role of government in education, and they say, look, here's where the voucher movement started with our champion Milton Friedman. And then the opponents look at the same time period. They say, hey, look what happened after Brown v. Board of Education, especially with the massive resistance in the South when these Southern states created voucher programs to get out of desegregating their schools. So both the left and the right look at the 50s and say, this is where this school choice movement started. And the idea of this book is to say, that's wrong, and to properly situate that period and the periods that follow in the context of history. And so we go back to colonial times talking about education and look at the development of education and school choice programs throughout history. And part of the way we frame the book is we say, you can't call it school choice in the pre-common school era, right? School choice sounds like you're leaving the public school sector and going somewhere else. But before common schools, that wasn't the case. We didn't have a robust common school sector. So the book starts with Jane Shaw Stroup laying out this sort of idea of what was going on in the colonial period, the time before common schools, and she talks about these American communities that were motivated by charity, self-interest, community spirit, all these sorts of things. Then we move into a chapter by William James, who talks about the development of education systems in the mid-Atlantic states. We follow that with a chapter by Dick Carpenter, who lays out how these schools were funded before common schools. And then we get into that common schools movement. And we probably should say a little bit about what that is. I mean, our audience might know what common schools were and the movement was, but I think sometimes, as education people, we take it for granted that the average public knows what we mean when we say common schools. So it was this movement in the 1800s led by Horace Mann, who was the Secretary of Education in Massachusetts, to create free public schools for everybody that were a bit more standardized than the fragmented system that existed before that. And so we have a chapter by Charles Glynn explaining this common school movement. And he describes it as an effort to liberate children from the influence of their families and their communities. And following that, we have a wonderful chapter by Ashley Rogers Berner explaining the different arguments against this common school movement. And she talks about the fact that schools can't be values neutral, and the fact that we need private institutions in a democratic society, right? So all of this wonderful history are periods where people are fighting over education, fighting for the right to educate their kids in accordance with their values that we might not call school choice by modern terms, but which is actually part of this movement because it's all about educational freedom and educating your kids. We then have a chapter by Cheryl Field Smith. Common schools weren't common to all, especially Black Americans had to fight for educational freedom. And then we get to your chapter, Neil, which I think is a wonderful chapter that people forget about in this period of the 1880s to the 1950s. And I think this time period is the reason why we sometimes look at the 50s and think school choice. Nothing happened in this period. Well, that's not true. Lots of things happened in the 1880s to 1950s. It was a period of time fueled by 100% Americanism, nativism. We had this flood of immigrants, and you had this tremendous push to try to close, or in modern terms, what we might say, cancel private schools. You had laws where people were trying to outlaw private schools. They were trying to require every student to go to public schools. So it's pretty hard to create a voucher program in a time when everyone else is trying to kill your schools, right? But that's what was going on in this time period. And then we see sort of a reemergence start to happen. And Matthew Lee lays this out in his chapter with a reawakening of Protestants supporting school choice in the early 1900s and Catholics coming around to really supporting school choice systems. And then we get to my chapter in the 50s, where we look at the nuance of what was really going on. And I highlight Virgil Bloom and Citizens for Educational Freedom and this tremendous movement that's not talked about much to support school choice that predominantly took place in the North, not the South. And I recognize in that chapter that the stuff that happened post Brown in the South was real, right? That there were vouchers in that time period, but vouchers and educational freedom in the South during that period wasn't the goal. The goal was segregated public schools, and vouchers were a part of that massive resistance effort, right? So then we move past that. We've got a wonderful chapter by Ron Matus on the progressive movement for school choice. We have a chapter by Nicole Garnett on the legal arc and how we've gotten to where we are today. And we have Jason Bedrick really bringing us to the modern times, talking about the red state strategy, or the wave that we've seen for school choice and universal school choice programs in recent years. So the book really is a comprehensive look at American educational history, focusing with this eye on fighting for the freedom to learn, or really talking about educational freedom. And it's a movement that I think didn't start in the 50s, and it's not going to end today.
All right, thanks, James. I didn't actually pay you to say such nice things about my chapter, but I'll just respond by saying your chapter was great too. But actually, every chapter I think was really good, but yours especially excellent. And mine, I'll talk a little bit more about mine maybe as we go along. But I do think I should actually take the moment to thank all the contributors, because obviously without them we wouldn't have a book. And each one, I think, provided something, sort of unique and important. So you'll, of course, want to get the book and read all 12 chapters. I'll also just remind people that for audience Q&A, you can submit comments or questions on any platform you're on. And if you're on X, I know you can use hashtag Cato Events. And now I will send it over to Ethan, who will hopefully say my chapter is great too, but maybe he won't, and that is okay, because nothing's perfect.
Well, thanks for having me and inviting me to get to read this book and chat with you guys today. I will just start and get it out of the way. I mean, both James and Neil, your chapters are excellent. And I do want to say, for people who maybe are interested and intrigued by some of the history that James is talking about, this is a really readable volume. A lot of times we get contributions to education research or education history that are very hard to approach. The chapters are long. There's lots of footnotes. And this is a really approachable volume. All the chapters, as James said, it's a really the sum total is really impressive, and each chapter kind of builds on themes and resonates. And I think, to James's point, I think one of the big values of this is comprehensively it establishes something that I don't know many historians of education that would disagree with, the idea that we've long had educational pluralism, whether you want to call it educational choice, this idea that we have since the beginning had many different ways that we've delivered education. We've had many different structures, many different forms. Sometimes they're religious, sometimes they're secular, and that line gets debated a lot. And this is really important. And I think it's an important part of our educational history. And one of the things that I think we'll want to grapple with today is, the book really wants to set aside this idea that choice is something that comes out of basically a response to Brown v. Board. And I think absolutely on that score, it fulfills its purpose. There's clearly a history here. And I think, if we set aside this, I think, kind of, specious argument around that choice was invented as a response to desegregation, what does this history mean? And what is it supposed to do for us in policy conversations? Is the value of this history that there are some lessons there in terms of structure, in terms of how we accommodate different viewpoints? And I think, here, one of the things that is maybe it's in the footnotes, but maybe is a bigger theme, is one of the themes of this early history of school choice, or this early history of pluralism, is that we see a lot of accommodation, and actually a lot of communities accommodating a bunch of different views. Ben Justice has a book called The War That Wasn't, which is a volume that looks at, he was expecting to have a lot more arguments about Bible use and a lot more antagonism. That's not to say there wasn't antagonism. There clearly was, especially in certain places, especially around Catholics. But more often than not, we see communities kind of accommodating different views around school choice. And so, one argument is that there's a history here that we can go to and find lessons from. There's another possible value of this history, which is that, especially as we get into questions about legal precedent and the Supreme Court and originalism, that this history guides us toward, something that is important that we need to preserve and we need to use in interpreting the Constitution. If that's the case, then it gets a little bit more complicated than maybe is at first blush. One of the things that we know is true about this history that James's chapter and Neil's chapter and all the other chapters establishes that, the governance of these schools, and in some cases they were public schools, public money going to religious schools, was the public in its governance structures, whether that was school boards or other structures. They got to pick and choose. And this was seen as also part of that history, that it was possible to support some forms of religious education and not others, some forms of secular education and not others. So sometimes we look back at that history and say, well, this is the history, we need to regain this past. But if we do that, then it comes with some complicated questions about what is the role of the public in selecting or choosing. It goes to another theme that I think hopefully we'll talk more about. It's alluded to in the book, but I think given that I think you establish your premise so strongly, that there is this history. So what is the history of regulation with respect to private schools or religious schools? And that history is also pretty complicated. One of the things that we know is true in the 19th century, in the early 20th century, private schools actually are willing to engage with the public around regulation, around school buildings, around certification of teachers, around curriculum, in part because they want more synergy between the private and the public school. So I think this history is really interesting and is really rich. And I think one of the things that I hope we'll do in the next bit here is think about what we can do with this history. What does it mean to us? How does it guide our some of the debates and discussions? I think we'll always have some impulse toward school choice. I think we will not, as James said, get rid of this history. I think what it means to embrace that history and what it looks like going forward in terms of having a public that has always been interested in, if not selecting for their own children, also having thoughts about how other children should be regulated. And we see that today, where we both have, I think, the strongest push for school choice on both the left and right that we've ever seen. But we also have pretty strong impulses about what all kids should have access to, or which subjects should not be taught in our schools. So I think these impulses run together. And one of the challenges of embracing this past that this book does so well is thinking about what its implications are for the future. And I hope that'll be a basis for our conversation.
Fantastic. Thanks, Ethan. Actually, you've led into some questions that I was going to ask. And I thought, well, I'm not sure I'm going to ask these, but now I am. We'll get to that shortly, but I think that regulation piece is actually really big and may be sort of the key question as we move forward. But we're going to look back because it is a history book, but especially that forward-looking piece I think is important. Ethan, you are a historian, so let me just ask a question. And we should have maybe asked this to ourselves before we did the book, but it strikes me as we were looking to do the book, and as I've been involved in education policy for a while, that there's kind of a dearth of books that cover school choice, especially that sort of spans the range of American history. So this is what we tried to do. And as you know, there are a lot of things we couldn't get into, or we didn't get to as deeply as we could, but we wanted to give this sort of sweep from colonial history to today. Am I right that there is sort of a dearth of books in this area? And if there is, do you have any sense for why? Is it because this was not really even an issue in many people's minds if you go back before 1990, or am I just missing a whole lot that's out there?
No, I mean, the one book that I think if people are really interested in this, and you're exactly right, the nice part about the book is the chapters are nice and short. They establish an argument, they set it up, they provide evidence, and the chapter concludes. So there isn't this deep dive. The one book I would recommend for people who are really interested in this history, because you're exactly right, there just aren't that many. Robert Gross has a book called Public versus Private, about this period, this critical period in the late 19th century, early 20th century, where you both have the rise of Catholic schools, you have a lot of families. One of the interesting parts that he tells, and again, I think this goes to this, really the core argument of the book, is that, this choice, this moving between public and private, this sort of pluralism that American schooling has always supported. One of the arguments he finds is that families often didn't want to just choose Catholic schools. They wanted the ability to go back and forth. And that encouraged both the public system and the Catholic school system to try to work together, to try to align their systems so that it was possible to do that, so that it was possible to say to the public, like, well, we really are looking after all the kids in our city. We know where they are. We can track them in terms of attendance, that they're not, in factories or other places, and that families then could be empowered to continue to choose. And part of that was to move back and forth between the systems. So besides Robbie Gross's book, there really isn't a lot of history around this. And I don't have a good explanation for why, other than I think maybe part of it is that it's such a specific part. I mean, it's such a taken for granted part of the school system for so long that it doesn't receive a lot of comment, except for around these very well studied antagonistic moments where Catholics in New York or in Boston and sort of the efforts like the Supreme Court case Pierce that comes out of Oregon, where the public tries to ban private schools. So I mean, there are the little pockets where you have these big blowups, but most of the history it's there. You're exactly right, and I agree with you. It's a timely point to rediscover. The Supreme Court has recently thought about this history, and I'll just give a plug to I have a law review article coming out with a colleague, Aaron Tang, where we look at some of this history and talk about how the history suggests that the public was able to pick and choose among these sort of these plural options in terms of providing funding. But I think it's a lost part of the history. I do think that James's point that we need to set aside this argument that it has to do strictly with Brown v. Board and a response to Brown v. Board. It also doesn't, in my mind, even if it's true, and it is true that there were segregation academies there, that is a part of the history. People can support good arguments or good traditions for the wrong reasons. And so that the idea that association somehow poisons this history or should make it unavailable, or that this shouldn't be a policy solution because of this particular moment, has never struck me as a particularly convincing argument. And so I think more history along this line is needed. And I think this book makes an important contribution to that.
James, thoughts?
Neil, can I jump in? And it goes back to something Ethan said earlier about what do we do with this history? I mean, I guess I'm one of those nerds who likes reading history for history's sake. I just enjoy it. It was fun to me to read the book as a consumer after it was published, and just to go back and read it. I enjoy that sort of thing. But what do we do with it? I mean, I think you're right in saying we don't look at this and say, look, we didn't have to fund public schools. We had lots of literacy before we funded public education. We don't want to, take the lesson and say, let's just go back. Maybe some people do, Neil. I don't know. But I think you don't look at this and say, I want to return to any specific period. But I look at this and say, the system that we have today isn't given, and it's not inherently good or superior to what we could potentially develop in the future. And that's what you see throughout our country's history, is these continual battles in different directions, and an evolution in one direction. But you could imagine a future that's different and that's structured differently. And I think that's the takeaway I get when I read this book in its totality, is that the future isn't written, and we have the ability to shape it how we think it should be.
Great. So we do have questions starting to come in. Again, if you have questions or comments, you can submit them on whatever platform you're on. And I do know, because I use too much X, that if you're on X, you can use hashtag Cato Events. Maybe you can use that on other ones. I don't know. There's so many platforms now, they're impossible to keep track of. But I get all the questions, comments, and we definitely want to get to those. I have a few more of my own, but soon we will move along to what you in particular want to know about. I have a question. So again, the title of the book is Fighting for the Freedom to Learn. And inevitably, if I write a book or edit a book, you put it all together and you come up with a title, and then like books I've done years ago, I spend much of my time regretting the title because I'm like, oh, that was too inflammatory, or that didn't quite get what we were trying to get at. And I do think that Fighting for the Freedom to Learn kind of captures a lot of what the history is. But part of the question that I have for you guys is, is it fair to say it's really fighting for the freedom to learn? And this has been something that, I encounter, and James, I'm sure, and Ethan, you've seen this as we debate school choice in the modern day. People will say, well, you actually have the freedom to choose whatever you want. It's just you can't necessarily take public money to do that. So is it sort of wrong to look at his history or even today and say, well, this is an incursion on freedom, when you can, other than, again, we did talk a little bit about Pierce Free Society of Sisters, but setting that aside, generally saying we have the freedom, it's just you shouldn't be able to take public money necessarily to these private options. So are we going too far in saying that a lot of the history was an incursion on the freedom to learn? And either one of you can answer first.
I have some thoughts, but I'll let you jump in first if you want, Ethan.
No, I got the first one last time, so go for it.
Well, I mean, you're putting it politely, but I have heard this same comment on X or other places impolitely a lot, right? From people who don't like school choice and say, if you don't like public school, pay for a private school yourself. That's the argument. And it's not new. Like we see this, especially when I read through Virgil Bloom and Citizens for Educational Freedom. These were arguments they got quite often as well. I think that if you had no public education system, then being able to choose wherever you send your school you would be free to learn however you want, you pay for it yourself. But when you have a public benefit, which is that's what the public education system is. It is a public benefit that anyone can access. And it doesn't matter if you're rich or you're poor, doesn't matter where you live. Every single child in this country is entitled to go to a public school. And when we create that public benefit, we create a competition for private schools where you have to pay to go to them, right? So that you lose the benefit by expressing choice. So if you choose to go to a religious school, a Catholic school, a Protestant school, and Montessori school, whatever it is that's not offered in your local public school, you lose the benefit. And your school where you have to pay tuition has to compete against the public schools that get the funding. And this is part of what we saw in that period that you wrote about, Neil, is there were some efforts to start creating even a federal Department of Education where we could have greater centralization. You again had that 100% American push. And Catholics were fighting against that because they were worried about the unfair advantage that the public system would have if it had all these public resources and you had to compete on with the private dollar. So I can understand the argument saying, well, you're free to choose to go wherever you want. But from my position, if we want to have a public education system, it does go back to Friedman, and it goes back to Bloom and others, that you shouldn't have to choose only the public provided system. Those dollars should be able to follow you to the type of school that you want. And so I think that's the crux of the argument nowadays, is that we, in the modern system, when we have publicly funded schools, should you only be allowed to use those at public schools, or should you have choice over those dollars and be able to send your kid to the school of your choice?
I mean, I would just add, I mean, I think there are maybe 2 points to add. I mean, one, I think you want to maybe distinguish between periods where, in segregation and slavery, where there was really, a ban or, real strong prohibition on teaching either certain types of things or certain, slaves just are not allowed to go to school, are not allowed to learn to read, those kinds of things. So, I mean, I think we want to, acknowledge that there are, freedom to learn might mean different things to different people in different contexts. I think maybe where I would well, maybe what I just add, it's not, I don't agree or disagree. We're not debating school choice necessarily, but I mean, the piece that I think you would want to add is the one argument historically for why private schools did not make arguments like the one that James has laid out, where it's like, this is public money, we're a school too, we should get it, is that it was always understood that if you accepted public money, it came with strings attached, that the public then got to say or have some input on how you organize your school. Obviously not taking subjects off. There are Supreme Court cases, you can't ban them. You can't just say you can't offer instruction in certain languages, things like that. But the idea that there was some regulation, there was some oversight that came with public money was always a reason that private schools did not advance these arguments, because they wanted basically a lack of interference. I mean, the flip side to that, that interference is democratic governance, and one place where historically people have felt very strongly, and we want to remember that the reason that schools, and you can't really overstate this, and this is something that's made well in the book, that you go from basically having no public school system to having a very large public school system. And these public school systems are taking up a huge amount of state and local budgets. So, at some level, we have to recognize that if a system is that popular, that successful, and that people are voluntarily sending their children there, that it must reflect some set of values. And so I think that one of the rubs in sort of the modern instantiation of school choices, so where does that governance impulse go? A lot of these schools, when we're talking about the early school choice, these are small communities. These are communities where people know each other. They're often one-room schoolhouses. There's a sense that the schools are of the community. Now, when we think about school choice, we often are talking explicitly about how we need to break down the tradition of localism, that people should be able to go anywhere they want. We are talk about virtual academies, other things. So, I mean, I think the idea that, that governance piece, that people should come together to have conversations about what they want their children to learn, and that those should be in the community, I think is also a tradition that we want to think about where that goes, even as we might support arguments that like James is making about that, fundamentally parents should have more choice or more rights to, or put it differently, that the private schools shouldn't be potentially disadvantaged because of the way that they've arranged them, or how they're deciding to educate their kids. But that public oversight, I think, always kind of looms large, especially when we think about the history of school choice.
Well, all these. Oh, sure. Go ahead.
Well, can I respond real quickly to, part of what he's saying about the regulating of schools, school choice advocates will oftentimes point to Europe and say, oh, look, there are a lot of school choice programs in Europe, but oftentimes they have the choice of a private school, but the private school's heavily regulated, just as Ethan was saying. So I think that, there are different models of how you do school choice, from a highly regulated private system you could select between, or a completely unregulated system. And that's part of the debate he's talking about.
So I have a question that I was all prepared about Europe, and I was debating, well, should I ask this question? But you all are teeing it up. So that I'm going to ask that as sort of my last question, because I think it really gets us to the future. I have another question before I do that, and then we're going to try and get to audience question and answer. So again, if you are watching, please submit your comments, questions. And if, by the way, you have a comment, it is totally fine with me. I have given up on saying just send a question, because people like to give comments, and it's easy to respond to comments. So feel free. And if you, if you're unhappy about anything, or you're really excited about the book, whatever, just let us know, and we're glad to field questions or comments. Before I get to Europe, which will be sort of my kind of capstone for my questions, the first thing I was going to say was, historically, so the question of funding versus freedom, and can you have freedom without the funding? If you go back, and I would want to double check this, but you can go back to the writings of John Hughes, who I think became eventually Archbishop in New York in the 1840s. And that's the first time I'd seen, although probably somebody else has done this, and I think I saw it in his writings or sermons. He mentioned this idea of paying twice for education, that you pay once for public schools and you pay twice if you want something else. And I think that's sort of the crux of the concern. Is it's not that you don't have the freedom to choose something else, but it's almost like it's inequitable that you would have to pay once for public schools and then something that you felt served served you well. But Ethan was saying something that I think is sort of important, which is we certainly see conflicts, and sort of sometimes very deep and painful conflicts in American history and education about what are taught in the schools or policies in the schools. You think of the Philadelphia Bible riots of the 1840s in particular. You can go to the Kanawha County textbook wars in West Virginia in the 1970s. But generally, there does seem to be a fair amount of peace with public schools. I think a lot of it is grounded in a localism, especially historically, where people were tending to also live with people similar to themselves. And as I've studied school choice, it strikes me that it is more a matter of providing often smaller, politically less powerful groups who maybe can't get an accommodation for what they want, the power to choose something they think is right. And to me, that always seemed like a civil rights issue. And we hear people in the school choice debate sometimes saying school choice is the civil rights issue of our day. I actually think that may overstate things. More importantly, I haven't seen it actually kind of catch fire as part of the debate. So am I right in thinking that this connection to school choice to civil rights hasn't been as powerful rhetorically as maybe some people would hope or think it was? But is it wrong to think of this as often a civil rights issue? And either one who wants to go first is fine with me.
I feel like I have to jump in since that's how my chapter starts. So I apologize, Ethan, for taking this one first. But I think it is a civil rights issue. But I agree with you that it hasn't had the same resonance that the civil rights had. I mean, fighting for educational freedom, the ability to choose your kids, just doesn't motivate people the same way a fire hose does on an unsuspecting black crowd, or the same way that discrimination did. That led to these huge marches in the streets and rallied people in, I think, a different way than test scores do. But you do see, I think, some purchase, some resonance with the school choice language in that it's framed a little bit differently. They don't say, they don't always say it's the civil rights issue, but they might say your destiny shouldn't be determined by your zip code or something along those lines. So we see a lot of things around students shouldn't be assigned to failing schools just because of where they live. And I think that's akin to the arguments that you might make from a civil rights perspective.
Yeah, I think that's basically what James just said. I think is basically right. I mean, we would want to. Yeah, I think it's hard to equate movements. I think it also the language of civil rights has gotten. I mean, algebra was a civil right, and there were all these like rights that kind of and so maybe some of the purchase of that framing has worn. But I mean, I do think that, and this is a point that I apologize, I can't name check the author, but that this is a movement that has in the 60s especially. Lots of people on the left said essentially the bureaucratic system is not serving a whole bunch of people well, and we need opportunity to experiment, to do things that are different. We need local control. Elizabeth Todd Braylon has a really nice book about the history of called the politics, education and politics, about the history of Chicago. And one of the arguments is that the Black community in Chicago often wanted and advocated for, we see this also in New York City at the same time, that communities want control of their schools and want the system to basically be broken up or the power in the system being spread out. And so this idea that it's not a left or right thing, it's a critique, these arguments are often made are advanced because of a critique about an unhappiness or dissatisfaction with the current moment. And Campbell Scribner makes an argument that one of the reasons that school choice and the private choice takes off in the 60s and 70s is in part because of the collapse of localism. That once you get the dissolution of this tradition where decisions are being made locally. So his argument is that increasingly we see both the left and the right looking to state policy or federal policy, which basically just disempowers people. And he argues that we lose this democratic tradition of local schools in part because people are really frustrated that they're disempowered by a system where it seems like and more important decisions are being made basically further and further away from the schools. And so I do think that this idea that people feel very strongly about the education of their children, about the children in their community, and that often school choice is a response to the closing off of participation, of democratic processes breaking down. The only other thing I would just add is just as a response, because this idea of double taxation, Neil, is exactly right, is a recurring theme. We don't always think of everything that is funded in the public, that if you don't use it or get a direct benefit for yourself, that you have been sort of unfairly taxed or something like that. So, I mean, I think we can be sympathetic to the argument, and certainly historically, federal money has gone for busing, transportation, for school books. We have recognized that we don't want to disadvantage private schools in certain ways, and provided public money to facilitate education. But we want to balance. I think it's probably maybe not so productive to think of everything that we're taxed for as if I don't get a benefit for myself, then somehow I've been double taxed or unfairly taxed. That can lead us down into unproductive thinking. But I think this history is really important, and I'm glad we're thinking about it together.
Yeah,
Neil, I want to say first. Ron Matus. It was Ron Matus's chapter.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, it's a really good. Again, I think the balance in the book is really important. And so for people who maybe see something with a Cato on it and say, well, that's not for me, I do think the book does a really nice job of showing the intellectual variety of support for school choice, the different traditions that it comes out of. I mean, obviously Catholic schools, but it really is. I think it does a good job of showing the range of people over time who have made arguments of various forms in favor of pluralism, of school choice.
So let me get to, we have a question from a viewer that's related to what we just talked about, so the civil rights piece. And then I may have some additional questions that piggyback off of what we just talked about. But since this one is right out of it, it comes from somebody, I don't have their name, unfortunately, or what platform they're on. But essentially they say, for 30 years in my Rotary Club, he's discussed that often lower income or minority groups will have lower sort of standardized test scores on average than typically sort of white or wealthier kids. And he said that Friedman advocated for choice 70 years ago, I think in part to address this. And he says, and yet it only seems to have recently gained traction. So what changed? Was the argument that we need choice in order to help people who appear to be underserved by this system? Is that what changed, or was there something else that sort of lit the fire under school choice, maybe in the 90s, and then, as Jason Bedrick writes about, even more in just the last 4 or 5 years?
Well, I think you can't downplay the role of the courts. I mean, I touch on this in my chapter, where Citizens for Educational Freedom gets started in the 60s and gains hundreds of thousands of members, and are really making tremendous movements, fighting for textbooks and fighting for school busing and all sorts of things for private schools. And then there are a series of lawsuits that go against funding for private schools. This is the time period where we get the Lemon Test and other important court cases. And the school choice movement gets a tremendous setback. And the advocates, there's some private letters and whatnot where Bloom says basically they can't raise funds anymore, right? They can't advocate in the same way because of these setbacks. And I think if you read Nicole Garnett's chapter on the legal arc, you see how some of those rulings really put the kibosh on, I don't know if that's the right term, but they put a stop to a lot of school choice programs. And then finally, you fast forward in time to the more modern voucher movements, and you have the overruling of some of those cases, the relaxing or the removal of the Lemon Test. And you see now a very friendly Supreme Court to school choice programs. I think that's a huge part of the story.
Ethan, anything on that?
Yeah, I mean, I would just add, I mean, there's the argument that that the schools were failing, and that they were failing minority students, urban students, rural students. I mean, the No Child Left Behind push to make visible how schools were doing, and to disaggregate data. And this was an effort supported on both the left and the right to really try to make it visible to the public how our schools were doing. I mean, I think that, for me, that conversation drove a lot and helped, I think, sustain the charter school movement when it was, which is a form I think of as choice, as not vouchers, but this idea that we want to empower parents. We don't want to just say, you have to go to your local school. I mean, places like New York City, places like Milwaukee, trying to create some, whether it's competition or just options for parents. I mean, I do think that the accountability movement helped bat down some arguments that, charter schools were only, were always worse. Maybe they weren't as totally transformative as some of the early advocates said, but they clearly weren't, terrible. And I think that we see that minority families of minority children often support charter schools. They support choice programs. So, we have to acknowledge that is part of this story. And I think, the testing movement and making an empirical case that this isn't gonna collapse or the system, or that these charter schools aren't inherently bad. I think that's a piece of it that's helped drive and assure families that, I can make this choice for my family, and that's okay. I mean, the other piece too, that we've seen the largest sector of, or the fastest growing sector of homeschooling is also families of color who have decided that the public school system doesn't support their children or doesn't communicate values in the way that they want. And so we've seen, that's a different form of choice. But I think all of these things are coming together to kind of see that we have more demand, I think, for options on school choice than we've seen in 100 years.
Going back to the double taxation question, we have a question sort of related from Thomas, and unfortunately I don't know what platform Thomas is on either, but Thomas says, please address the claim that school choice takes away funds from public schools. And I think it connects to the question of I think it is sort of problematic that we talk a whole lot about, well, it's about the money, but it is about the money. And when we talk about double taxation, I think one of the reasons that education becomes a particularly fraught area where people say, yeah, but it's a problem that I have to pay taxes for public schools, it's because it involves values and the shaping of children, and people are very defensive about that. I think it puts it on a different plane than, say, how do we spend money on paving the roads, or whether or not we have public parks or something like that. But is there any way to separate school choice from the question of where money goes? Because in the end, that's sort of the crux, it seems to me, of a lot of the debates, including whether or not it takes money from the public schools, is that money is kind of what makes a lot of things possible. So is there, is there a lot to this argument that school choice takes away from public schools? And can we frame this maybe in a different way than just where's the money go?
I have thoughts. I mean, it's sort of outside of the scope of what we're looking at in the book. We don't, have any sort of calculus in the book that gets at that. You should read my friend Marty Lucan, does a lot of good fiscal work for Ed Choice, and he can tell you all about it. But I think that when you start advocating arguing over whether or not school choice programs cost money or lose money, you're going to lose a portion of your audience, because it is simply true that if students leave, dollars leave, right? That's how we fund education in every state. It's largely based on the number of students you serve. And so if students start going elsewhere, the budget's going to go down. Now, how much does it go down? And do they get to keep some local dollars? And what's the net fiscal impact, right? They're all important questions. But to me, I go back again to Virgil Bloom in the chapter that I wrote, and the argument that he was making is that who do the dollars belong to, and should we lose the public benefit of dollars simply because we make a choice? Would you choose to go to a different school should those dollars follow your kids? And so I think that's more of a philosophical argument and question that people could debate, rather than debating the numbers that you might do in a modern policy debate.
Ethan, anything you want to add to that, or?
No, other than again, I think when you start, I think James is exactly right. I mean, at a most basic level, the way that we fund schooling means that yes, it takes money away. Whether that's right or wrong, I think, as James suggests, it's a philosophical question. The only other piece is what I said before, which is, I think the public, when you do accept public funds, I think you have an obligation then to account for how you're spending it. I do think the public then, and this is historically at least, has had a say in how those funds are spent. And I think that's where we're going to see, some rub, and not to cue up the European question again, but I mean, this question of like, okay, we can have a conversation about what happens with public money, and if it goes to private schools, most of the time we want to say, well, you have to provide an account, and then we might want some limits on what you can and can't do with that. And I think that's a piece where I think the future of school choice will be around those kinds of questions of what strings can the public attach to providing it, whether it's, you must provide, like in just some examples in the current situation where, if you're accepting vouchers, then you have to provide the state assessment, or you have to, be willing to take students with disabilities. You have to, there are certain things that come with that. And whether that's, again, whether choice advocates will say, well, you're forcing us to do things that we don't want to do. And I mean, so I think there's a little bit of a slippery slope there. But I mean, I think that the question of money and then purpose, public purpose, becomes quite entangled and quite challenging.
Great. If anybody has questions or comments, you still have some time to get them to me. Not a whole lot. I think we got about 10 minutes left. But I want to address two things, and just sort of to tease the end of this, we're definitely going to address Europe. I don't think there's any way we can't. And it actually does tee up a question that I wanted to ask that I think will sort of provide bookends for the history and then go into the future. But since Ron Matus has gotten a lot of, I think, richly deserved discussion about his chapter, which is really about progressive support for school choice. My chapter is about a hibernation of the school choice movement from 1880 to 1850. His is about a progressive movement for school choice that you'd say maybe starts in the 1960s and sort of peters out by the end of the 1880s. Do we think that this progressive support for school choice is sort of an equalizer and a way for the politically powerless to have some power to get what they want in education? Is that progressive movement hibernating, sort of like the school choice movement hibernated 1880 to the 1955? Or is it something that we shouldn't expect to see coming back? Or maybe are there already signs that there is rising progressive support for school choice?
I mean, my view is I think if you said like 20 years ago that charter schools were going to enter the public conversation consciousness and basically be, a very large sector and growing sector in many states, liberal, blue states, purple states, red states, I mean, I think people would not necessarily believe you. I mean, when I was in graduate school now a while ago, like it was a serious, like knockdown, drag out, the charter schools, the existential threat. I think now the system has, for better or worse, kind of absorbed that as a model. It's very popular, especially with, parents, families of color. And so I think there's some disagreement among the progressive wing of our country about whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. I mean, Obama administration, Arne Duncan were supporters of charter schools, and that is something that I think a lot of progressives try to wish away or hand wave. I think there is a sector of people who think that this should be part of our system. It is part of a system in many cities, including places like New York City, New Orleans as a whole. Chartered now. I mean, so the idea that this is like some kind of novelty, I think is like we're way past that. I think it's a permanent part. I think now the question is, how far will the support go? So, okay, yes, progressives, I think, by and large, have accepted charter schools. They're still not there on, I think, a lot of voucher programs. And then as it kind of pushes out, because I think the other thing that the book makes clear is that what school choice means and the policies associated with it are quite varied. And so I think what you're going to see is that the point I made earlier, that this idea about empowerment and local control, and the idea that families have different values or needs, or they want different messages, that's been a recurring theme across the country in rural communities and urban communities. And I think that will endure. I think, where it may break down is, the specific policy or how far you're willing to go, or the idea that maybe that we should try to dissolve some of the strings that go with public funds, then I think progressives might withhold support. But I think the wind is in the sails of the choice movement. I think it's hard to, you don't have to treat that as a good thing necessarily, but I think it's hard to argue that it's not, at least from where I stand.
I think that Jason Bedrick's chapter is really relevant here. I mean, if you look at the school choice movement of, say, the 1990s, the two primary camps were the sort of free market Republicans, the Milton Friedman types, and the social justice sort of Democrats who believed, sort of to the points Ethan was making, that the schools were not serving Black communities or people of color, and they were, clearly we could see this on the test scores, they weren't doing well, and so you had this bipartisan strategy to try to push school choice. And what Jason argues is, in recent years, there was a deliberate shift in the strategy to move to appeal to a different base of the Republican Party to support school choice. Because when you had those original two groups, the biggest opponents were rural Republicans. Rural Republicans typically have a lot of seats in state houses, and they stopped things all the time. But the red state strategy, which Jason articulates, was to appeal in a more values-based approach to those conservative Republicans. And we've seen a tremendous wave of school choice success using this red state strategy. But that progressive group of Democrats are still out there, but I think they're still wrestling with that other group of Union Democrats, or the sort of diehard I mentioned before 100% Americanism, which was a theme in the late 1800s, early 1900s. It's almost like we have 100% public schoolers who think that it's the only possible option, and they're diehard on this and want everyone to be required to, go to public schools or something like that. But that group, I don't think, is ever going to be won over with school choice. Now, you might grow the progressive ranks some, but I think you're going to have staunch opposition among some groups of Democrats. And I will say that there are good things about public schools and public education. I'm not the type that tries to bash public schools, but I just happen to disagree with them in thinking that this is the only way that we should provide a system of public education, is through only public schools.
We got a lot of questions. I'm going to get to one more here from somebody. We'll try and answer it fast. Then I'm going to get to Europe. Then we're going to be done. And I know that Ethan doesn't have a whole lot of time. And thank you for giving us the time that you have. Somebody, again, I don't have their name. They said, hasn't control of the curriculum actually been the 600-pound gorilla that no one wants to talk about? How much of historically or today do you think curriculum has been a part of it? My own thought is a big one, especially if you include religion as part of the curriculum, because those were what many of the earliest battles were about. Is that still like the driver of school choice?
You want to go, Ethan?
Go ahead, James. That's fine.
Well, I think curriculum, I mean, depends on how you define it. When we had Common Core, there was always a debate about what is curriculum, but being able to choose the stuff that your kids are learning, but also how they're learning it, I think is incredibly important. So the what they're learning might be important for some religious schools, but how are they learning? Is it a Montessori school or a classical school? Like, that is increasingly important, is the educational or pedagogical philosophy of the school. And so I think that's a big movement towards the micro schools as well. So I would say it's a combination of what they're learning, but also how they're learning.
Yeah, I mean, the content has always been a big piece. I mean, this goes back to the 19th century, as the book lays out. I mean, arguments about catechisms and what Bible and that sort of stuff. I mean, so I think that the text and the idea that the state or the school is endorsing certain views or giving some views more prominence or a better play than other views. I mean, I think that's always been the issue, and it's a concern not only for people's own children, but when we see states trying to say you must take a course in this, or you must not ever hear about this. I mean, what those arguments are about are essentially curricular, and so I think that piece will always stay with us. People care about the young, and I mean, to Neil's point earlier, schooling conversations do have a different valence because of that, whether it's your own children or you're just worried about the future of the country. Those questions about what exposure, how much, in what order, in what form, and what curriculum and also pedagogy takes, I mean, those are always going to be at the center of conversations about school choice.
All right. So somebody asked, by the way, if the book is available on Kindle, and it is. If you go on our website, you'll see a page for the book. It gives you a whole lot of options where to buy it. But I promise we get to Europe, and I think this is a good way to pull this all to a close. So, if we look 25 or 50 years from now, will we still have a school choice movement? What will it look like? And it occurred to me that maybe it ends up looking like Europe, where you can choose schools that have lots of different worldviews, but the government, usually the national government, says, but you must teach X, Y, and Z. You have to have lots of other rules that you might need to follow, even if you have that separate worldview. Is that what we're looking at, an American future 25 or 50 years from now? Or do we just don't know?
I mean, I'll let James have the last word because he's an editor in the book. I mean, I think I would be surprised if we didn't end up in a space where you see, and again, I'm just imagining the future, not saying this is good or bad, but I mean, Ashley Berner, who has a chapter in the book, I mean, has talked a lot about, written a lot over her career about the school, this idea of pluralism in Europe, and that they do support religious education with conditions about what schooling covers and doesn't cover, and those kinds of things. I would be surprised if we don't see a move towards a
I think we lost Ethan. Oh, we were doing so well. But I think that he's saying, oh, is he back? No. I think he's saying that we are heading toward a European future, possibly. James, what do you think?
Well, I want to give a plug for federalism. That's one thing that we have that maybe Europe doesn't have. We've got 50 states with 50 different policy structures that could create different types of systems. And I suppose what you'll see is some states that still maintain a very robust system of public schools, and you're going to see some that move much more to a decentralized system. But I think you'll see a combination of things in between, that we will have a movement for regulation of private schools that participate in private school choice programs. But one of the things we have in the United States is a very robust and healthy private sector that will fight against those regulations as well. So I don't think it's a given that we're going to be accepting, a lot of strings attached with the dollars, but I think we'll see a mixture of rules and regulations throughout the 50 states. Uh-oh.
This will be recorded, so anybody who wants to see it, you can see it online. Again, the book is Fighting for the Freedom to Learn. James and I were the co-editors. Thank you, Ethan. Unfortunately, Ethan, you froze for just a moment, frozen in time, which I suppose is apropos for a discussion of history.
Historians should always be frozen in time. So that's a good enduring image of me, I think. There you go.
Well, and I thank you for your great comments, for reading the book. I thank everybody at the Cato conferences, AV, everybody who helped put all of this together. And of course, I thank everybody out there for joining us. And again, this video will be available online in perpetuity. And you can certainly, I encourage you to get the book, buy it for your friends, your family. And thank you again.